then I will introduce the speaker. So I'm pleased to introduce our returning speaker, Professor Agassi, who's a Professor Emeritus at Tel Aviv University. He's written extensively on the history and philosophy of science, aesthetics, politics, and education. And in a previous discussion with him, we talked about his book entitled The Philosopher's Apprentice in Karl Popper's workshop, which tells the story of his study under Popper at the London School of Economics. And today we'll be discussing Professor Agassi's essay, Training to Survive the Hazard Called Education. And it was a very nice essay, which I didn't expect to discover. First of all, I think your idea with the essay is that there are various philosophical ideas about education, and some of these are kind of variations on the theme. They all have certain things in common. Like, for example, most views of education take it as kind of given that we need instruction, that people should be instructed about how to learn and what to learn.
I can't deny that.
Right.
Immanuel Kant's book on education says that the sole purpose of education is to enable young people to learn to control themselves, and that you instruct them as the means by which you train them for self-control. But what you instruct doesn't matter. And he did this for a very simple reason. He took seriously the Enlightenment claim that it is forbidden to help people unasked.
Right.
Helping people unasked is called paternalism. And the Enlightenment movement is opposed to paternalism. And therefore, the Enlightenment movement opposed instruction. That's very important. Before you can instruct, you have to be requested. And children don't request. And therefore, teachers violate this rule. And Kant asked, by what right do they violate this rule? And he answered, the children are not human. And he explained that children are not human because what characterizes human is the categorical imperative. And children cannot abide by the categorical imperative because they have no self-control. How Prussian. And so the purpose of education is to enable them to have self-control, and then all instruction becomes self-instruction.
Right. Could you remind both me and possibly the audience of what the categorical imperative is?
The categorical imperative says more or less, don't do to others what you don't want done to you. This is, of course, not the wording of Kant, it's the wording of Hillel the Elder. It's an ancient wording, but that's the best wording I know.
Right, so
Popper also took this wording to be the categorical imperative.
And so I think that both Kant and other kind of people who thought about education had to somehow argue against the idea that instruction is a bad thing. So that's kind
forbidden.
of, yeah.
You see, most claims of instruction, even today, is that you help the instructed be able to sustain themselves, to earn a living. And of course, earning a living is very important according to the categorical imperative.
Right.
But the categorical imperative says that you should not help people unless asked.
Why is earning a living important according to the categorical imperative? Is it because then you're more able to help others?
Because otherwise, the categorical imperative says you should not abide by a rule that not everybody can abide with.
Right.
For example, you should not steal because if everybody steals, there is no private property. And the same goes for earning a living.
Right. Right. So if no one earns a living,
yeah. I think this is all mental gymnastics. I think nothing of Kant. So I'm very prejudiced this way.
So you say that there are really two, maybe three main views on education by the time of you writing this essay, one of them being like the classical view.
One.
Yes, the classical view of education.
There is the paternalist, there is enlightenment, and then there is Locke. John Locke wrote an essay on education which solves the problem. He says two things. First, every young person needs a mentor. Secondly, the mentor should not initiate anything. And that sums up, in my opinion, the philosophy of education. And John Locke says it and explains it and so on.
Could you summarize the other two views?
Pardon?
Could you summarize the other two views, the paternalistic? I guess you've summarized.
The traditionalist view is we are what we are by virtue of our culture, and it is imperative that our young ones, etc.
Right. And
so the traditional attitude is you have to transmit our culture to our young, and how is of a secondary importance. Let's say, of course, you should do it nicely if you can, and if you can't, do it by hook or by crook. That's a traditional view. That's the view upon which I was raised, and I suppose you were raised too.
And you think that there's various inadequacies, which I probably agree with it. So this view, for example, leads to people learning things which are not actually necessary for their work later in life. It goes beyond that.
The supposition of most educators, teachers and theoreticians is that kids hate learning. And this is so false. Popper says even puppies want to learn. They say the desire to learn is natural. Kids refuse teaching because it is imposed on them. I'll give you what I consider the most obvious examples. Children are, without exception almost, excellent mathematicians. They learn to count. They learn to count by twos, by fives, by tens. They learn to count backwards. They learn addition and subtraction. For multiplication, they need some support, some help. But they learn a lot alone. 1 + 1 kills them. And so we should stop teaching 1 + 1.
Right, and then the usual reply would be, aren't you worried that this would lead to people not learning basic skills?
Yes, I am worried about this, and I think this worry should be permanent.
How come? What makes you say it should be permanent?
Because it's always possible that people will not learn, and that is highly detrimental. For example, if you don't know how to read and write, you can't drive a car in a modern society. You know that. And this is really a great impediment.
It's quite an impediment, yes.
Yes, of course. So we have to see to it that kids learn, but we don't have to impose it on them. And by the way, the most important thing is that kids don't know what you teach and why. Even in college, if you take a college mathematics course, there is no question all over the world, they start by teaching you algebra and geometry. And I know why, but many professors who teach this don't know why. And Locke said, when you ask them, they can't answer it.
So why do you think that they teach these subjects?
First of all, they should teach only what students ask. And this is impossible for one reason. If you have a school in which they teach only what kids ask, I don't know if you know, such schools are called free schools. That's the word for it. And you know what kids want to learn when you ask them what you want to learn? Do you?
Well, I think it's probably unknowable because they all want to learn different things.
No, they all want to learn the same thing. And you don't know what it is.
Yeah, I suppose it would be. I suppose it would be the basic skills if they haven't learned those.
No.
No. Okay, then I don't know. Then I'm just going to be surprised by the answer. I think.
Sex. And you know why? Because at home they can't talk about it.
Right.
Now, what happens in free schools, I don't know. I taught in a free school. I was a co-founder of a free school.
Oh,
Sudbury Valley School, a very well-known school. When kids ask instructors to teach them about sex, you know what they do? They talk about reproduction. And then very quickly, the kids get tired and say, let's talk about airplanes. Because they're not really interested in sex. They ask to talk about sex because they want to know why parents make such a big deal about it.
Right. Yes, that makes sense.
So the whole thing is hardly problematic, and it's the major obstacle to proper instruction. This is mind-boggling.
So what do you mean when you say it's the do you mean that the idea that we should instruct people, or the fact that their questions are not being addressed?
That's right. That's right, because it embarrasses the teachers, the parents, and so on. I don't know if you read George Orwell. He wrote a fictitious autobiography. You don't know that.
Is this? I think I know which book you're talking about. I don't remember the title. Where he is it Down and About in Paris and London, something like that?
No, this is autobiographic, but it's not an autobiography.
Okay, right.
Anyway, he describes, he tells a story about a woman to get a distance from himself. And in that story, the woman, in one of her adventures, becomes an elementary school teacher in East London. And not being trained as a teacher, she tries to improvise, and she brings Shakespeare in a simplified version to kids. And amongst other words, she uses the word womb, and she's fired from school.
Womb, right, okay.
Womb, yes. I suppose that this rests on some experience that Orwell had, because that book has a lot of personal experience in it, but that's another story.
Right. Yeah, so I suppose this is still covering the basics. I feel that people who would listen to this, they would ask themselves, well, isn't it the case that children just need to be forced to do hard work, and that learning is hard work, and therefore they don't want to do it?
Yeah, this is something like that, but in any way, they are not challenged. And in my paper that you mentioned, I give advice to young people how to encounter the system. The system is too big for a kid to fight, but I give them advice what to do. For example, to pretend to be a supervisor.
Right.
When a kid in class pretends to be a supervisor, at once the pressures come down. He becomes critical of the teacher.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting aspect. And this is kind of where we, I suppose, go into critical rationalism and populist philosophy. It's like, right. Yes. But where in, like, how would children learn how to be critical in school? That seems like.
Yeah, I should only add that Popper was against the application of critical rationalism to education.
Yeah, I've heard about this. Is it because he? Is it because he thought that children were not capable of being critical?
He thought that children are dogmatic, which, by the way, is true. Children are dogmatic. I don't know if you know, if you tell a child a fairy tale with a variation of one word, they stop you and they ask you to change it. You know that, don't you?
But aren't they also rather curious and critical in that they are constantly asking questions?
Children ask questions, but not out of criticism. On the contrary, they ask many questions, and then their parents say, shut up, instead of saying, let's select the questions that are more urgent.
Right, but isn't the motivation that they want to be critical, that they have something about the world that they don't understand, and they would like someone to explain it?
Children are all magically minded. When you have a child's image of the world where your horizon is the horizon of the world, and things and people enter your world and disappear, this is a magic world. That's why all children are magically minded without exception. In the paper on magic that I wrote with Javi, we said that most of us are still magically minded anyway.
Oh, that's an interesting comment. So I would like to ask why.
Well, we wrote a few papers on magic. You can read them.
Cool. I suppose I'll do that then. Yes. Yeah, but I think that children do learn a lot about the world, and they would have to be critical, and they would have to have some capacity for criticism if they're able to learn.
It's not clear. I think this question that you raise is very, very difficult and hardly studied. And all educators and education theorists whom I read, whether they are Popperian or not, all of them were very poor. We need more knowledge about these things. We need to discuss this in more detail.
Is there any specific way in which they are poor? Like, is there a criticism that you have of that kind of applies to most of them, for example, something that they overlook in your mind?
I think the teachers who want to discuss education are afraid to start with the assumption that children needs no education, which, by the way, is an obviously false hypothesis, no misunderstanding. But I think we should begin there.
So you think we should begin with the idea that children
needs no education at all?
Right.
By the way, in my opinion, the worst confusion about education in the West is confusing schooling with education. I think compulsory schooling is unavoidable. My son calls schools minimum security jails, and I think he is right. And I think that's how it should be, because we don't know what to do with kids. We have to go to work, and we don't know. In Scandinavia, they tried to bring children to the workplace. I don't know if you know their experiments. And so these things are very problematic. On the whole, the movement for the improvement of the quality of working life is just young and beginning. So I can't go into all these enormously revolutionary ideas that make the problems of what to do with children different from what they are now. But now children at school age are pests, are problematic. So first of all, we put them in schools, which is obligatory schooling. But obligatory schooling need not be obligatory education. In free schools, there is obligatory schooling, but not obligatory education.
And do you think that is, do you think that that's the best? Right.
I think the fact is children crave education.
So in your mind, that's not the ideal solution, but it's a step towards the right direction.
That's correct. That's correct. I don't think there is an ideal solution, and every solution depends on the social background, and social backgrounds are all defective, as everybody knows, and so on. So we don't have to aim at the moon, but to aim at livable with conditions. And as I say, already Locke had the idea rightly. So it's not so revolutionary.
You write about other people who are like education theorists, such as John Holt, and you
find John Holt intolerable.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting. I'm quite a fan, but I'm curious about your criticism.
So intolerable about Holt is that he makes proposals that most schools in Massachusetts, where he lived, accepted, and he proposed them as revolutionary. Which
wasn't this
atrocious.
It wasn't this in, so I think I don't actually know that much about John Holt's intellectual life. Well, no, I know a bit of a detail, but he, as I understand it, he became critical of schooling with his book How Children Fail.
Yes.
But it seemed like he was still, which is the book that you mentioned in the essay and the paper.
That's right.
But he seemed in that book to still be pretty much kind of tied to education.
He faced a genuine problem. That's what you want to say, and you're right.
But then later on in his life, he switched to a more radical position in which he advocated for unschooling and for children to only go to basically learn at home at their own pace and learn what they're interested in, which seems something that I would have thought you would be very much for. So how
I learned from Popper the idea that at least teaching the 3 R's should be compulsory.
Hmm.
And now, of course, arithmetic should drop out because of computers. So there are only 2 R's.
Right. So you think that is still something that children should learn, even in their unschooling?
Yeah, if need be. I think that mostly there is no need. For example, I had no difficulty learning to read.
Yes.
I
So
had instructors, but I had the freedom to listen to them or not, and I listened to them greatly because I very much wanted to read the illustrated children's books that came my way.
but isn't there a contradiction in that? Because you seem so much against instruction. And
no, against compulsory instruction.
Right. Yes, against coercion, I should say.
Coercion, against coercion.
Yes.
And
so,
even that, as I say, if you have to teach reading, writing with coercion, I won't object. I wouldn't like it, but I won't object.
But again, it's not the best way of teaching it, you would agree? Or do you think that it is?
That's my point. You see, the funny thing is that in the Jewish tradition, reading and writing was taken, reading was taken so much for granted that kids 3 to 5 years old craved being taught to read.
Yeah, I think that also reminds me of something John Holt said, which is that we have kind of an obsession when it comes to thinking about what we should be learning.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not something that we are, we have kind of unnatural ideas about it, or we have these superficial ideas about what we should be learning, and we're very concerned with it. It's kind of like people being concerned about their weight or something.
I don't know if you know, publishing children's books is very difficult. The market is so fixed and saturated. It's really very hard to sell any children's books, whether fiction or language instruction or arithmetic. It's very, very difficult.
And you think that that's because children, sorry, I'm kind of trying to,
Go ahead.
Is that because you think that children do not necessarily want to learn that, or is that because you think
I think we are not liberal enough about it. But I think there's something of both sides.
Right.
And as I say, I think much of the coercion is unnecessary, but I'm reluctant to speak against coercion to read and write. Oh, sorry, to read. Actually, most of my students can't write, but that's another story.
I see that David raised his hand, and I'm very curious what he has to say.
It just reminds me of, which I think, I'm fairly sure I read this in one of Frederick Douglass's autobiographies, where he describes how when he was a teenager and he was a slave.
Oh, yes, decidedly, he wrote about it and he spoke about it extensively. You're quite
yes,
right.
so he and his fellow teenagers would secretly go out at night after a hard day's work in the fields and go to a lady who was illegally teaching them to read. And now, so this just shows the strength of the desire to learn to read, because if they had been caught, she would have been had a heavy fine at least, and they would have been whipped.
You're absolutely right. People forget that doctorate is licensed to teach.
Sorry, I don't get the connection.
You have to have license to teach, read and write.
Oh, I see, right, yes.
I mean, in medieval Europe.
Right.
The universities were founded at around 1000. And since then there were licenses.
Yes, so she wasn't allowed to, but she did it anyway.
That's the point, you're quite right.
But I wanted to make a different point, which is that now the great grandchildren of these slaves don't want to learn to read and have to be forced. Now, whose fault is that?
The systems.
It's this, yes, I mean, it sounds a bit trite to say it's the system. It's the assumption, the prevailing assumption that children don't want to learn to read.
It's even worse. The prevailing assumption is that you are evil. It's called original sin. And the proof of it is that you masturbate.
Yes, well, I don't know what the position of the slave owners was on that, but they surely understood that their slave children wanted to read because otherwise they wouldn't have enacted laws against it.
Yes, yes. Also in South Africa, I remember in the elections, Malan said, "You don't know, things are very bad. There are Black people who use screwdrivers."
I see, yes.
That was a part of Malan's election propaganda.
Yeah, okay, so I guess your position is that you seem concerned about children who do not learn to read and write. And
not only that, I have quite a general point. The general philosophy that all societies have is that there is irreconcilable conflict between individual and society, and individual must lose because society can survive individual, but not the other way around. And only in the last century or so, we discovered that most of what demand of individuals in the name of survival of society is unnecessary. I remember when first in Swedish movies, they showed naked women. The general response was, society is going now to the dogs.
right.
And again, during when there was a sexual revolution, people said, now nobody will have children and society will be it. And they said Sweden is now going to have no children and so on.
And the same point applies to education, where you think that we as a society, or society apparently needs people to learn specific skills, and really, if people pursue their own interests, it's enough.
Yeah, I have a general rule: before you force people, make sure that you have to force them. That's all. And certainly, the advice of Machiavelli was accepted across the board. Try to make the rules so that people would gladly abide by them. That's liberalism. And liberalism was a great success. If you look at the world now, you'll find that the rich part of the world is liberal and that the liberal part of the world is rich. And yet I have here a whole shelf of books explaining the failure of liberalism.
Yeah, that seems to be a trend right now.
That's the trend, of course, yes.
Yeah, to be disparaging.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, to reimpose the old rules because they've been forgotten or not adhered to strictly enough.
Yes, yes, and everybody is so ignorant and so on, you know.
Yes.
We are going to the dogs because culture is not sufficiently well preserved and so on. Well, all these ghost stories are really very funny.
Then I have another question about the essay, which is related, namely, you do seem to oppose the idea that children are self-directed learners, which kind of gets back to whether they should.
Children need mentors, I said. So I think Locke is right. I follow John Locke. John Locke wrote a short essay on education, which I think is the last word. And he lived centuries ago.
And then another question would be, I didn't, when I read the essay, there were various points where I thought, this is great, but I'm not sure how you want to put things in practice. I think in the later, like in the final sections of the paper, you actually get to that. But could you explain what would you want to see change?
First of all, I say I'm a pluralist. If there are many ways to implement an idea, I think you should try them all. So first of all, I find it really upsetting that Kant always tried to look at the best solution and adopt it. We don't know the best solution. We should try different solutions and see where they go. How to do it? There are so many traditions, and you can take from each tradition the friendlier part of it, the friendlier aspect of it. For instance, the question how much physical education should be a part of education and so on. There are many technical questions that I didn't go into for want of place, but these things are for the experimenter to try. I can't forget the story of an famous intellectual, I don't remember his name, who reports that he was a very unruly student and his teacher it suggested to him that they have a secret private language, and only later he learned that it was Greek.
Nice. But you do have some ideas about what should change, I think. Like, for example, you envisage a different university system, which...
Oh, I oppose the university system because first and foremost, it is only since 1945. So people don't realize that the traditional university altered. For example, in 1830, again, all the university system was changed. And for example, the fact that London had a university only in 1830 and not before made it very special. University College London, in case you don't know. And it was really a beacon of modernity at the time. I don't know if you know, Oxford had a science laboratory only in the 20th century, and Cambridge had the first science laboratory in 1870. The experimental philosophy is 1660, and Cambridge had the first university laboratory, and it was 1870. By the way, Scotland did it before because of James Watt, but that's another story. I can't go into all the details. So all in all, I would say, ask yourself how universities changed and whether it was necessary. For example, I don't know if you know, but you could enter university without any preparatory work and without paying any fees. And
no, I wasn't aware of that. No, I wasn't aware of that.
Until 1830, it was like that. Actually, the modern university is a product of the French Revolution. And also the scientific societies, other than the general society, for instance, the mathematical society, biological society, all are 19th century, not before. So people don't know how much our educational system changed, and every change was an experiment, and every experiment needs a summary. And there are no summaries, almost. There are very few. There is a book. There are a few books. I don't want to go into this. In my book, I discuss this. You can go to the internet and look at my book, Academic Agonies and How to Avoid Them, Advice to Young People on the Way to Academic Careers. And then you can read what I think about the academy. But there's no question, for example, that lectures were very reasonable, and that they stopped being reasonable when printed press was popular. And
you mean reasonable in the sense that they were useful, and they were less useful after
they were useful
became available.
In antiquity. Slaves copied books, and in the Middle Ages, monks copied books, and in the university, students copied books. And now that the printing press is so cheap, there is no need to lecture. Actually, whatever lectures you want to give, put them on a CD.
Yeah, I
CDs
also
are
wonder
now
about
so
that
cheap.
as well.
I discussed this over 5 centuries ago, 5 decades ago. I had a meeting in Frankfurt, which is the scholarly center of Germany, with all the owners of the big printing presses of Frankfurt. I had a seminar in Frankfurt University and discussed it with them. And they said they would gladly accept it if I could guarantee authority.
Don't you think that, so I actually agree with that point very much. I think it's somewhat strange that we do not have more lectures that are recorded than that are used as official kind of teaching materials in universities, especially now that we have YouTube and other like really easily accessible websites.
Yeah.
Including Popper Society. But yeah, I think there is something to in-person interactions that is difficult to replace. And
No question
I think it could be.
It's why we should have seminars, not lectures.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no interaction in a lecture room where one man speaks and a few hundred men copy, or men and women sit and copy what he says. This is not interaction. This is one way.
And also
to
expand a bit on your point, I think what you were trying to say is that we lost some important traditions during these changes, and also gained some new ones.
Yes, on the whole, I think we are better off, but not as much as we could.
And what do you think were some of the improvements?
As you say, the availability of lectures. But of course, I'm waiting for the annulment of the university fees. This is really criminal. There should be no fees, and there should be no entrance conditions.
I think I agree with the entrance conditions. I'm not sure. I quite like free markets and things like that. So maybe
I also like free markets, but you forget the fee system is more expensive. I don't know if you know, in public transport, it has been shown that if they don't charge fees, it will be cheaper.
How does that work? Could you explain?
Levying fees for public transport is more expensive than lucrative.
So you mean providing it through taxation, or maybe I'm misunderstanding your point? Providing.
If all public transport would be supported by the government, by town hall and so on.
Right.
There would be less private cars, and therefore even the environment would benefit from it.
I think let me say I'm skeptical, but I think the larger point I agree with that. I think the issue of requirements is very interesting, because that will be unintuitive to people.
Your doubt is extremely reasonable, because you need paper and pencil. You need to calculate. There's no other way. When I say this is cheaper than that, then you need paper and pencil.
Yes.
Of course, you're right.
But as I think what people would say, and what might be an obvious first reaction would be that if you don't have an entrance exam, then you can't just let everyone partake in university life. It wouldn't be possible to have hundreds of people attend lectures, for example, or to grade hundreds of papers.
Listen, in 1945, I was an employee of the university, and I knew all the staff of the university, not the maintenance staff, but the rest of them. And there were about 20 people at most. Nowadays, they say that there is an official for every 2 academic employees. And I think this is understatement, but at least that is agreed upon, and that is much too much. The university could be run really with much fewer employees. Think of it that there are employees who take care that people who didn't take Algebra 1 would not register for Algebra 2.
Yes, that is an interesting point. Yeah, that
now
is.
I ask, what damage would be for people who are, say, people who don't know French, who enter a course delivered in French? What damage would they cause? Nothing, because you don't even give them tea and biscuits.
Yes. Yeah, I agree that is somewhat ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's.
But wouldn't those people waste the lecturers, or waste the course teachers' time and the other students' time?
Yes. The question is, would they waste more or less? The question is comparative, not absolute.
So you mean there are entry requirements and there are still people who waste time with is that what you mean?
No, I say the entrance requirements are what takes so much unnecessary work.
Right, so you could be paying the professor the difference between what the entrance exam person would be paid instead of having the system in place where people,
part of it, of course. It's not only that person, also the office, the table that that person sits at also has to be purchased and maintained.
Yes, also there's something very strange about how we incentivize people to learn in universities, because you would want people
to... This word gives me the shivers. Why incentivize?
Well, I think that's how people think about it.
Yes, and I think this is wrong. Yeah. I think people have enough incentives.
Yeah, it's that.
I told you, Papa said even puppies want to learn.
Yes,
and you know that Papa was he was a substitute school teacher.
Yes.
It always makes me smile. He was a substitute school teacher, not good enough to teach school.
Yes. It would have been interesting lessons, I suppose. Yeah, we were told by another speaker that he had various ways of dealing with his classes that were interesting, like never turning his back to the students while he was writing.
No, the joke was he would see kids talking with each other, and he would turn to the blackboard, write, and say to these kids, "Stop talking with each other." And they thought he had eyes in his bed.
Right. But yeah, to return to the point about universities, it is very strange that, for example, grading in universities doesn't quite make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to me that we kind of dissuade people from learning about things which would be new and difficult to learn by giving them lower grades. I think some of the most interesting courses that I followed in university have been courses that were...
About grading, I would say students need grades and they should be graded, but it's no business of the university what their grades are.
So you mean it as like a form of feedback, really?
Feedback, yes, that's the right word, yes.
Yeah, I think grades are a very bad form of feedback, though. I think people often just register what grade they got and then forget about any other feedback that they received. It's just a number for them and then they move on. But I agree with your point about feedback being a good thing.
We need really more teacher-student exchanges. I remember when I read a Harvard book about student-teachers interactions, and what it showed mostly is that how rare it was for a student and a professor in Harvard to talk with each other. By the way, most of it would be in the urinary.
Right. Yeah.
Lionel Robbins, who was he was the uncrowned king of the London School of Economics. He wrote an autobiography. And he said that he became a university teacher by accident and that he had very little advice and practically all of it in a urinary from a senior professor who gave him two pieces of advice, one of which he took. And by the way, there is a Lionel Robbins report, which is very important in England. And one of the things that he said was so common is that all junior faculty agreed that instruction about instruction should be available.
Instruction about instruction.
Yeah, should be available to young colleagues.
What does that mean specifically, instruction about instruction?
How to prepare a course, how to deliver a lecture. In Australia, at a certain stage, they asked actors to instruct professors. And the actor gave good advice. I'll give you an example. If some students make noise at the corner of a lecture room, you don't want to stop the lecture and to speak to them, but you find it distracting. So all you have to do is to walk towards them and continue the lecture, and they'll stop. And that, an actor taught the professors in, I think in Sydney it was, I don't remember exactly, which I found very interesting.
Isn't that still a bit uncomfortable, though? It's a bit intimidating, but I suppose...
It is. You see, I don't mind stopping a lecture before the bell rings. And actually, I once stopped a lecture course before the semester finished. But usually this is considered an outrage. It is considered a risk to your career.
Why you stopped the courses in those cases?
Hmm? Because I found the students intolerable.
Oh, you mean
only
talking
once in my career.
You mean that people were not paying attention during the courses, or?
I don't want to go into detail. The fact
Okay, yeah.
I didn't want to continue, and I stopped. And the administration came down on me, and I said, I give everybody a grade who wants. And I asked every student to write a paper. I'll give you another example. When I taught at Boston, there was a company that sold papers to students for grades. And Boston University sued them. And I was asked for my opinion. I said, I side with this company. And I was asked why. And I said, if a professor doesn't know the difference between a written and a bought paper, then they deserve what they get. Very simple.
Yes. Sound. So we've been talking for about 45 minutes. I think if people have questions in the audience, please feel free to raise your hands. And David, go ahead. You're muted at the moment.
Sorry about that. Yeah, about grades. Now that we have the internet, I watch quite a lot of lectures online, and I can't imagine what I would do with grades. The vast majority of the lectures don't even have a test at the end, or even a voluntary test. They don't bother with that. And I think I know what I got out of the lecture. I mean, if I'm not getting enough out of the lecture, I don't even watch all of it. I stop halfway or stop after 5 minutes. And if I go through to the end, it's because I think I have gained something from that lecture. And if I don't need grades, why do students need grades? I don't think they do.
Don't you think
Their
that there's
employers might need grades?
I have an answer to this. I think we don't need grades. We don't need certificates. We need things like driver's certificates. I don't know if you know, in Denmark, they once stopped driver's licenses, and they found that the rate of accidents was up, so they installed it, reinstated it. And I think most of the documents have to be technical. I give you an example. Rabbis are known as scholars, but to become a rabbi, you don't need to be a scholar. You need to know certain ritual ideas. Actually learn the least interesting Talmudic tracts, which is most practical. You don't appoint rabbis for the wisdom, although you expect them to be knowledgeable and wise and so on. But they say you have, I think you can demand teacher certificates. In Switzerland, they demand clockmakers certificates, for example.
Oh, and now why would anyone need a clockmaker certificate? Because
Switzerland thinks, in Switzerland, they think that the reputation as a clockmaking nation is very important for their economy, and they don't want to lose the reputation. And by the way, the idea of Switzerland making clockwork was really made by an educationist called Pestalozzi, who said Switzerland is a poor country and it has no natural resources, so we have to teach our students. He actually invented compulsory education in order to raise the economic standing of Switzerland, and he did a very good job. He made his country rich and from the grave. It was really remarkable. So whatever a nation thinks they have to protect by licenses, for example, nobody questions that you need medical licenses.
I agree, though it's not the university that should provide those.
Of course, in some countries it is the government, say like in Italy, and in some countries it is schools, like I think in Britain. And in some countries it's not clear who does it, like in the United States. It's very interesting that there is a central body that gives doctorates, but they claim that they have no responsibility. They take it from the universities, and the universities ascribe the responsibility to them. So actually it falls between stools, and this is very dangerous, of course. So I think technical documents like driver's license are necessary, and doctorates are not. As long as doctorates were teaching licenses, then they were reasonable. But today it's ridiculous. Nobody would dream of having teaching licenses. So we don't need them. Of course, I took care of my doctorate because I wanted to be an academic. It is therefore, in my opinion, the kind of membership of an interest group.
Even that is strange. Like you would suppose that if someone is able to like publish papers in reputable journals, then they've shown they're skillful enough to participate in academic
This is why many universities give you a doctorate if you have 5 publications.
Yes.
So your point is well taken and well taken care of.
Yeah, although I think there's still something in the culture that people are reluctant to go about an academic career that way.
Oh yes, when I mentioned that A.J. Ayer was one of the leading British academics had no doctorate, they are very, very surprised, shocked to hear that.
Yeah, same with Freeman Dyson, who also didn't have a doctorate.
Yeah, they excel too quickly, yes.
Yes. Yeah, there's something, it's like illegitimate not to have a doctorate degree. Yes, have a,
and that is, of course, very dangerous, because the question is not whether you have a degree or not, whether you have a document or not, but whether you perform your assigned tasks reasonably well. And you know that many professors are boring, and they are boring because they think they should be boring. So something needs to be done.
Yes, I actually had a comment for David, the question for David, because he said that you don't really need grades when, for example, you're watching a lecture. Don't you think that there's a level of understanding that you gain when you watch something or read something on your own, and then you find that when you have a conversation with someone and when you're trying to work through exercises or something like that, you see that you had certain misunderstandings because of the level of engagement you had?
Everybody reading something or watching something has an idea of what they want to get out of it. Only very rarely is the thing they want to get out of it the highest possible degree of expertise in that domain or on the subject matter of the lecture. In those cases, which I think are very rare, in those cases, you might want to do some worked examples to see whether you've really got it. But I think even then, not always. I just saw, speaking of watching things on TV or what, I just saw a documentary about the 2 allegedly greatest clockmakers of the second half of the 20th century. Both of them were completely self-taught. One of them wrote a book which then became the definitive book on clockmaking, and he made some innovations which were the first innovations in clock mechanism for over 100 years. And he wrote this book, and this other guy, the second one, had also been self-taught and happened to hear about this first guy, who was quite old by that time. And he went to see him and he said, "I want to be your apprentice." So he said, "Well, show me a clock you've made." So he showed him the clock that he was very proud of. And the old guy said, "That's rubbish. Stop wasting my time." So he went away, and 3 years later, he came back with a better clock. And then the old guy agreed to take him as an apprentice.
How interesting. You know, Chinese myth is full of such stories.
Is it, what is?
Chinese mythology.
Oh,
is full
right.
of such
Yes,
stories.
but this happened in the second half of the 20th century. You know, one of these two is still alive.
As I say, it's very, very interesting, of course. There's no question about it.
Sorry?
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
But I want to report the first lecture that I had. I remember it like today. The teacher came in and made some technical remarks about registration and degrees and so on, grades and so on. And then he told a couple of jokes, mainly about himself, against himself. And then he cleared his throat. So when he cleared his throat, everybody picked the pencil. And then he said, axiom number 1. 1 is a number. And I lost him on the spot. This is, by the way, Peano's axiom, and it's a very well-known thing. And it was 1900, and I'm telling a story of 1945, so it was fairly modern. But I lost the lecturer after one sentence. He said, Peano's axioms, axiom number 1, 1 is a number. And it hit me so hard, I remember it like as if it happened yesterday. When sorry.
Oh, yeah, no, go ahead.
No, I'm not reading the Bible. Go on.
Yeah, no, I like the story about the apprenticeship, and I was wondering, that seems to be something which is slightly lost in universities nowadays because there's so many people attending courses, and it seems like very few people have that kind of interaction with really anyone in university. Even like teaching assistants do not have that level of engagement with the student usually.
But teaching assistants are much nearer to the students than the professors, so they have more interaction, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I think I'm just saying it's a shame that I'm assuming that in the past this was somewhat different, that in the past professors had a more kind of, they had a closer relationship with the students. And
I always advise ambitious young people to look for a teacher and go and be the student. And you have to look for a teacher by deciding what you want to learn. And you look at the literature to see who are the leading people in this chosen field of yours, and go to them and ask them to help you. Not always they agree, but some do. For example, Popper agreed with me, but he was not my first.
Is that how you met Popper, or how you first were introduced to him?
When I read half of Is the Nature of Philosophical Problems, I knew he was my teacher. I hadn't met him yet.
Yes, that seems like a very sensible way of finding people to engage with.
Yeah.
But by the way, I want to go ahead. Sorry, yes.
He wrote the paper after his clash with Wittgenstein.
I'm not sure I understand the connection there.
Oh, you see, I studied physics, not philosophy. And since my adolescence, I found positivism an obstacle. And The Nature of Philosophical Problems is the first anti-positivist paper I read.
So this was the paper that you read. Sorry, I see. Yes.
It was in the British Journal for the Philosophy of Science. And that is a journal that Popper co-founded.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know that either.
Yeah.
By the way, I wanted to remind other audience members that, again, these are opportunities to ask questions if you want to. We won't use coercion on you. I see we have a question in the chat, so I'll read it out. I don't know if this is an issue in your part of the world, but in my country, some of the instructors at the university would fail you for approaching a problem in a different manner, even if you got the correct answer. You simply get penalized for not following the exact order of steps. So, kind of a comment. But I'm curious if you have a response.
You want my response?
Yes, if you have one. I'm not sure, it's just kind of a general
such people
comment.
Exist everywhere, and the question is how difficult it is to avoid them.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of another point you made in the paper, which is that there is a real concern that we should have for people who kind of fail education, which is not at all something most people are concerned about. Like usually, so this is kind of, I guess it's somewhat vaguely related, but that usually whenever we think about education, it is like, how do we get the most people into Ivy League universities, as you say in the paper? But there is a real question of why is there not more focus on people who find classes difficult and have a hard time getting high enough grades so they can pass the year or something?
Well, this is general in every field. It's not only in academics. And you have to be independent, and you have to be both self-critical and self-assertive. And these are conflicting tendencies. I don't think there is any solution. I remember in my younger years, I struggled with this situation where to be self-critical and to insist on your own are in conflict. The Romantics say you have to really, really feel it to follow your perception and block all criticism. And this, of course, is terrible. This led to fascism. As a matter of fact, it led to fascism. So the Romantic answer is terrible, but I don't have an alternative to it.
So you think that that's really up to the student? It is not so much a matter for the university specifically. You have to have certain skills that will allow you to get through university in the right way. I think I'm also partly thinking about high school, where the problem is worse because people are coerced into being there, and it's somewhat absurd that we're not more worried about.
In the Israeli army, the commander has to listen to criticism of his plan of action. He doesn't have to accept it, but he has to listen to it. In both Israeli Air Force and in the American Air Force, there are critical sessions of analyzing all past actions. And in most armies, when people come back from action, they go through briefings. So criticism is really a part of the Western world, even in war, which is the least adequate form.
And
I don't know, for example, if you saw the movie The Man in a Gray Flannel Suit. It's a movie against cooperation. And it describes cooperation as not fully uncritical, although fairly uncritical.
So it's a movie about, you mean business?
About cooperation, about business cooperation, yes.
Right. And sorry, what was the title of the movie?
The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit.
And the point is that they, even
that
there,
you can't
people
avoid
are
criticism even when you think ill of it. You say even people who find criticism hostile and unbecoming, even they yield to criticism.
And I think I'm confused again about the connection between your point now and the point about university, because you were saying before that we should have a certain amount.
The teaching of the university is dogmatic for the last 1,000 years, but they allow for criticism all the same. That's my point. And to the extent that you have freedom, you should seek places where there's better criticism. For example, in big universities, almost every course is taught by different professors. Not always, but perhaps in consecutive years and so on. And students pay attention to the course, but don't look at the question who is teaching it and whether it's more dogmatic or less. I hope I answered your question.
Then maybe a related question is, how do you think that universities want to go change because of the internet? Do you think that, like, for example,
they have already changed even before that? The community colleges in America were the first deviation from the standard university tradition. They gave no grades, they gave no document, no degrees and so on. And they were much more reasonable and liberal than the universities, although they were of lower levels and so on. So there's always non-academic higher education systems. Although due to the bomb, actually, almost all higher education became university after World War II. Which was a shame, in my opinion. For example, all art schools, all music schools, and so on became universities.
Right. That actually never really occurred to me that they're different now than what they used to. But what did they used to be like?
There used to be all sorts of. I remember when the leading Israeli art school started giving grades, I spoke to the students at that time. I gave a talk and I asked the students if they think it was better or worse that they have now instituted degrees. And faculty members were there and they started the debate. And this was a lecture I never finished. And I'm so proud of it, I can't tell you.
You never finished the lecture? You mean you?
No, I never finished the lecture because the debate was live between professors and students.
Ah, right, I see.
The question is, why does an artist need to be BA? What's the meaning of BA for an artist? After all, an artist has a portfolio. And the portfolio signifies much more than a degree.
Yeah, but that is true. I completely agree with your point, but it's true universally. Like your portfolio should mean much more than your degree generally. Like
Indeed. Where you have a portfolio, of course. This is why I teach my students mainly to write, which I learned from Popper, of course.
And yeah, so that's an interesting point. I'm not sure I've not really thought much about art schools in a long time, but yeah, it seems like I can imagine a world in which art schools do not have grades.
They used to not have grades.
Yeah, that is very interesting. So when must that change?
I can tell you, the Pentagon needed physicists and they couldn't get them. So they tried to shame a leading physicist and it didn't work because he became a superstar after they humiliated him. So they decided to purchase the universities. So every time a professor received $100 by grant, the university received 100 or more without asking for them. So universities started putting pressure on professors to ask for grants. And that's the way the Pentagon managed to have physics professors work for them. Very roundabout way, but that's the point of the story, that it's roundabout.
I see that David shared the documentary in the chat. I might even, with David's permission, share it as a link in the YouTube video.
There. Cool. And I think I remember from the documentary that the older guy, Daniels, he invented a new type of escapement mechanism. And the escapement mechanism is the major cause of inaccuracy in watches. And he invented the first fundamentally new escapement mechanism in like 200 years. And it's interesting, the two of them had, although they were extremely different people with extremely different backgrounds, in regard to clocks, they had very parallel lives. Both of them just inexplicably got obsessed by clocks in childhood. And
they shared a problem.
Yes, exactly. And they had similar problems. But then at some point, when the younger one found out about the older one, then their stories diverged because the younger one wanted to learn from the older one. But the older one was completely, he was also, I think they said, the first person to have made a watch from scratch, that is, starting with the raw materials, for hundreds of years. Now they said in Switzerland, this is one of the things that reminded me. In Switzerland, there are something like, I think they said 32 professions involved in watchmaking.
Clockmaking, yes.
Yes, and you become an expert in one of those. Nobody becomes an expert in all of them. And this guy became an expert in all of them, the world's leading expert in all of them at once. Later on, he was actually hired by Omega, the clock company. And well, according to the documentary, he was instrumental in raising their profile because it was thought in the 1980s that mechanical clocks were going out, that nobody would want mechanical clocks anymore. And he raised the standard and created a new market of people who want superb clocks and are willing to pay a fortune for them.
But aren't today's hand watches built on different principles, on quantum?
Yes, yes. So, you know, nowadays everybody has, you know, an Apple Watch like this,
yeah.
and
being quantum
probably,
mechanical makes it so much more accurate.
Yes, but of course it can do thousands of things, not just to tell the time.
Right.
But there is I mean, watching this documentary almost made me want to go out and buy one, but I can't really afford it. But there are people who can.
Yes. Yes, I understand. And there are then different specialties like making them out of wood, which has to be very strong and so on.
Yes, yes.
It occurs to me it's also one of the things you might dissuade a child being interested in clockmaking. I suppose, were they both Swiss or?
No, they were both English.
Oh.
One of them was poor working class, and the other one was kind of upper middle class. And they had very different lives, except in this one way. It's very interesting.
A similar thing is, of course, working on jalopies.
Ah, one of them did that too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm kind of fascinated that they weren't like taught to focus on something else, or maybe they were, and but unsuccessfully.
Well, I think, one of them hated school, and the other one was bored by school. And they would go and you know, just do whatever was the minimum there, and then they would go in the evening. They would go to the garage and work on the clock or watch that they were just making. You know, and then the you know, when they got a job, they couldn't really hold down a job because they were making watches all the time.
But staying with education, it was Popper who said that worst thing about education is that it's boring.
Yes.
He said this in many places in the open society. That's the major problem of education.
Yes.
To prevent it from being boring.
Yeah, it seems like we have good solutions for that now, but people are, at least most parents seem not very persuaded that the solutions that exist are really solutions. Like, I think YouTube is a great place to learn things, especially things like clockmaking and like anything that you need visuals for understanding. YouTube is a great place to go to. And
almost everything is now on the YouTube, including, by the way, making nuclear weapons.
Is it?
Oh, yes, there was a fellow who did this, young man, and he was stopped in America, yes.
Oh, right. Yeah, they have cases like that sometimes, don't they? There's now also the question of, can you distribute information about how to assemble a gun using a 3D printer? I don't actually remember how that ended. I think that's legal in the United States, but I'm not sure. It isn't?
No. Of course, freedom of information in the United States is very strong.
And also things like games seem like good tools for learning. I know several people who've learned languages through playing video games.
That began with Monopoly, but the idea of it was from Montessori. Montessori was a physician, was the first Italian physician woman. And she tells the story in her autobiography that she saw a little girl playing on the floor and she picked her up. And the girl went on playing, not noticing that she was picked up. And Montessori said, at that very moment, I realized that everything they told me about children is wrong, because the kid was concentrating. And she started her educational system based on it, where playing and learning go together.
What you said about children being able to focus when they play games, nowadays, I think they would say, well, he might have attention deficit disorder, because that is apparently a condition, or from what I have read, in which children are able to focus on some things for extended periods of time.
The very discovery of the ADD is due to a new attitude towards teaching. This is why people don't notice ADD, because they assume that every child hates learning.
Can you expand on that?
You see, the attention deficit disorder is the difficulty in learning, in concentrating in learning. And this is not noticed if you assume that all children hate learning. What's the difficulty to understand? That's all.
Yes.
So it's only the new attitude to learning that led to the discovery of ADD.
And with the new attitude towards learning, you mean the idea that people want to learn?
The idea that children normally want to learn, yes, of course. I remember from my second grade only one thing. The teacher shouting at me that I should sit on the chair.
Yes. Yeah, it's. I actually think it's the opposite. I think that people have now started labeling more children as having ADD or as having attention deficit disorder because they are not paying attention in class.
Yes, but
it's kind of like medicalizing.
That kids should pay attention, and I think this is a wrong
exactly
assumption. The right assumption is teachers should be interested.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think children tend to focus on things which they find interesting, but then the things which they find interesting are labeled.
Of course, and as I told you, many lecture courses are boring by intent.
Is that true?
The theory is Francis Bacon's. Bacon said learning should be boring.
But you mean, do you mean that people actively have that as a goal, or do you mean that people like professors and lecturers have they have some kind of inexplicit idea about what a lecture should be like, and then
they try to make it boring? Because Bacon said if you make it interesting, then you make people biased.
Towards what?
You are biased towards or for an idea which you like, whereas you should follow the truth and not what you like.
I see what you mean.
That is Bacon. Bacon said it explicitly.
I'm afraid this is like we're nearing the end of the event. We're nearing kind of the end time I roughly had in mind. If anyone else has a question, then please go ahead and ask away. Otherwise, I
want to thank everybody, you in particular.
Thanks. Yeah, no, thanks so much for coming again. Liberty, I'm not sure.
Coming.
And yeah, it was a lovely conversation. And thanks everyone for being here.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.